How did Paul's letters first circulate? They didn't circulate as part of a bound book. We don't have autographs, the original letters, and we have to remember that Paul's letters were written as individual letters aimed at particular communities. They were often co-written, sometimes penned by a scribe, with Paul only putting his own pen to papyrus or vellum at the end. We're aware that ancient teachers trained their students in the arts of letter writing, and that there were conventional forms and topoi, just as we have today. Dear so-and-so, or I hope you're well. But at some point, these individual letters of Paul and his co-writers became part of a circulating set. They were no longer individual letters aimed at particular communities, but a larger corpus that was understood to have relevance for a broader set of communities. When and how did that happen? The earliest manuscripts we have of Paul's letters date to the 3rd century, roughly 150 years after he set pen to papyrus. It's overwhelming to think more broadly about the manuscripts of the letters of Paul. Scholar David Trobisch writes, approximately 800 early copies of the letters of Paul have survived to the current day. No two copies are completely identical. I'd like to give us a taste of what some of these oldest manuscripts looked like. The first way to address the question of how Paul's earliest letters circulated is to start with what's thought to be the oldest manuscript of almost all of Paul's letters. This is called P46, or Papyrus 46, and part of it's located at the University of Michigan, and part is in the Chester Beatty collection in Dublin. The text is from the 3rd century CE from Egypt. It's in fairly good shape, but the outer pages don't survive. The manuscript begins with Romans 5:17 and ends with 1 Thessalonians 5:28. Many pages still have their page numbers, and this is useful because scholars can figure out then that there were 7 missing outer leaves. The scribe also miscalculated the amount of paper needed. After more than half the book was filled, the scribe began to write more characters per line and more lines per page. The remainder of 1 Thessalonians, Philemon, and other letters traditionally ascribed to Paul, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, can't fit into the remaining 14 pages of the text. So this is the earliest manuscript of the letters of Paul, but it seems not to have contained the entire collection that we know. There are also 4 early codices that date from the 4th to the 5th centuries, not scrolls, but codices. They look like modern-day books that contain all or parts of Paul's letters. The first is Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. It contains all the letters of Paul with only a few pages missing. The second is Codex Ephraem Rescriptus from the 5th century. Originally, the entire Old Testament and New Testament were written onto it, but in the 12th century, the ink was washed off and the texts of the early Christian writer Ephraim were written onto it. Ultraviolet lighting helps us to see the palimpsest's original text. It contains portions from every book of the New Testament with the exception of 2 John and 2 Thessalonians, but none of the individual texts within the New Testament is complete. The third example is Codex Sinaiticus. It probably dates to the 4th century, and it's the only one of the 4 manuscripts that still contains all the books of the New Testament. It was discovered in 1844 at the monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt. In 1869 it was given to Russia, and in 1933 sold to the British Museum. We can say that it has all of the Old Testament and New Testament within it, but it also has texts that some Protestants today might not know from their Bibles. 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, 1st and 4th Maccabees, Wisdom, Sirach. And it also contains within it the early Christian texts, the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. The fourth example is Codex Vaticanus, also dating from the 4th century. Nobody knows where this one was found, but it's recorded at the Vatican Library as far back as 1481. The manuscript lacks 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, but perhaps those had been at the end of the manuscript. Manuscript evidence shows Christians were copying Paul's letters and circulating them by the 3rd century CE, even as early as 150 years after they were written. But remember also that this is a world in which oral tradition is highly valued. The early 2nd century Bishop Papias, for example, writing about the circulation of early Christian texts, says this: "For I considered that I should not get so much advantage from matter in books as from the voice which yet lives and remains." This is also a world of low literacy. We should picture publication of ancient texts less in terms of copying and circulation, not so much in terms of a New York Times bestseller list, but more in terms of people sitting together and hearing texts read out loud. We're still left with the question, how did early Christians first evaluate the letters of Paul? What discussions arose in those first 150 years and just thereafter, at the time when the manuscripts are being drafted and redrafted? Today it seems self-evident that Paul's letters are important to the Christian tradition. After all, they're in the Bible, first of all, and second, they're imitated in the New Testament itself by letters written in Paul's name, such as 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Ephesians, Colossians. Third, there's evidence that Christians were circulating the letters by the 3rd century. Even within the New Testament, we have evidence that the letters of Paul were considered scripture by some Christians quite early in the 2nd century. There's a passage in 2 Peter in which the term scripture, in this case the Greek graphos, also translated writings, does not refer to the Jewish scriptures as it usually does, but to Paul's own letters. So also our beloved brother Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom given to him, speaking of this as he does in all his letters. There are some things in them hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction as they do the other scriptures. Many early Christians thought too that Paul's letters were important enough to collect, but some thought that Paul's letters and his legacy should be resisted and rejected.